There are very few industries in this country that have as much power over our government as the oil industry. It's not just politicians. Oil companies have been actively buying off judges for decades, putting them in office with big money. And the problem is that the people that they put in those judgeships come right from industry. Joining me now to talk about this problem is Farron Cousins, the executive editor of the Trial Lawyer magazine. Farron, I think this is a huge story. You had an Obama-appointed federal judge that gave the oil industry this huge pass by dismissing a $50 billion lawsuit around Louisiana, where land loss from industry conduct, from the oil industry conduct, is so bad that Louisiana is losing a football field worth of land in wetlands every hour. And so, then we find out that this judge, this Obama-appointed judge, worked directly for the industry for decades before she became a judge. Didn't recuse herself, didn't remove herself from the case, just made the case go away. What's your take on this story?
They never recuse themselves. I mean, we've seen this time and time again. The Supreme Court, they don't even recuse themselves when they've gone out and, had dinner with some of the people. But this particular judge in Louisiana is especially disgusting. One, because it is an Obama appointee, unanimously approved by the U.S. Senate. No objection from Republicans, no objections from Democrats. She gets on as a U.S. district judge. And this lawsuit that she has dismissed was, the New York Times declared it the most ambitious environmental lawsuit in the history of the United States, which it really was. What they were doing is they were suing this Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority. East is the group that was filing the suit. They were going after 97 different fossil fuel companies for, as you pointed out, essentially destroying the coastline of Louisiana. And
well, I mean, first of all, it's wetlands, isn't it, Farron? Right. I mean, the wetlands is the only thing that keeps New Orleans from disappearing when you have hurricanes. I mean, they already have a huge flood problem. And the very land that's protecting these inland cities is the wetlands. But didn't the industry come out and say, I mean, the oil industry admitted that they've already destroyed about 40% of the wetlands, that their conduct destroyed 40% of the wetlands. Isn't that an admission by the industry already?
You would think so. I mean, in all of the reports, because this, Flood Protection Agency had been tasked with coming up with a mitigation plan, essentially. For many years since Katrina, they have been working on ways to figure out how to protect these wetlands so that we don't end up with another Katrina-sized flood of the city of New Orleans or any other city in Louisiana. And so while they're doing this, they find out the oil industry is responsible. State Department says maybe as much as 60%, but the energy industry says, you know what, we'll concede we are definitely responsible for about 40% of it. And the State Department says, well, maybe more, but 40%, yeah, that's a pretty good admission of guilt. I mean, that's as if a defendant walks into a courtroom and he says, yeah, I did murder this guy. And then this judge, Nanette Brown, is basically saying, yeah, you murdered him, but I'm still going to throw out the case. I mean, that is the type of admission of guilt almost that we're dealing with in this case. The industry said, yes, we did what we are being accused of doing. We did it, we know it, we admit it. And the judge still said, but I'm going to dismiss this lawsuit.
Give us a little more background on the judge. This story's almost, I mean, people are going to hear this and say, surely a federal judge. Look, Farron, remember in the BP case, you had federal judge after federal judge remove themselves from the case because they either had worked for the industry or had ownership in the industry in some way, form, or fashion. But they were decent enough to say, no, we're not going to get involved. It's not fair.
But you know what? Let me point out why they did that. And I'm not blowing smoke to you, but it's because you were getting on TV every night with Ed Schultz, and you told those stories.
Well, you
were the one going out there telling those stories, and nobody else was covering that fact until you and Ed forced that issue, and you made it an issue. You made the public talk about it. You made the media talk about it. And that's the problem, is that, we don't have enough of that anymore.
This happened under the radar, didn't it? Farron? Tell us how. First of all, the judge her roots are clearly not that she just worked for a law firm that handled environmental disasters on behalf of the oil industry. She actually did it herself, didn't she?
She did, starting in about the 80s, all through until she was appointed by Obama as U.S. District Judge. She bounced around to about 4 different law firms over that 20-year span, with a brief span as assistant with Mayor Landrieu down in Louisiana. But in every single one of those law firms, she worked on the defense side as an environmental litigation specialist. You can check the websites of every one of these 4 law firms, and each of them sits there boasting about the fact that they know how to go into court, sit next to the oil industry, which she did, and defend some of the most egregious conduct you could imagine, including this admission of guilt that we have about 40% of the wetlands being
Farron,
gone.
how did it get to her? How did the case get to her to begin with? And then I guess the second point is, why wasn't she decent enough to say, no, I can't do this objectively? How did it get to her to begin with?
Well, that's another dirty part of the story that nobody's talking about, is the fact that this case originally was going to go to state court, where it should have gone. This is a Louisiana issue with Louisiana companies and Louisiana Flood Protection Agency. But when the oil industry found out about it, they said, you know what? We're going to do what we call forum shopping. We're going to find a judge that's friendly to us and move the case into that jurisdiction, and we know exactly what will happen. And that's what they did. Nanette Brown did not stumble upon this case. She didn't walk into her chamber one day and they said, oh, by the way, you're going to have this case. No, she knew that they were shopping around. They specifically picked her, so they moved it from state to federal court, and that's how it ended up in her hands.
Well,
and
yeah,
that's how
and I got to tell you, she would have had to reach out for it herself to make it really happen, and obviously she did.
Right.
But what's so disturbing about this, aside from the judge part of the story, is that Obama, this is a pattern. This is a pattern of Obama's pick of these kinds of judges. I think what it is, it's almost he's so disconnected. This is a guy who, yeah, he was a professor of law, but he never practiced law. He doesn't understand even how the system works, I wonder sometimes.
See, that is a great point about Obama's personality in general. He was a professor. He taught. He wasn't in there in a courtroom, and he didn't have to stand up, take a side, and make a stand. And that's the difference.
Yeah,
he
and
never had to
in
fight
other words,
for what he believed in or fight for the little guy.
So in other words, this Nanette Brown might have been good on social issues. She may have been good on things like same-sex marriage or whatever the social issue of the day may have been, but nobody took the time to find out what is her real corporate connection. And with this Democratic and Republican Congress, you know, they probably would have been thrilled to know that she was so joined at the hip with corporate America. That's another part of the story, though, isn't it?
It is. They absolutely, both Democrats and Republicans, love Nanette Brown, because really there's no other industry that wields the kind of influence, the power of the purse as the dirty energy industry. They have bought every politician in the state of Louisiana. They give fairly evenly. Used to be mostly Republicans. It's evening out a little bit now, but they're giving to Democrats and Republicans, just hedging their bets. Whoever wins, they win.
Yeah, it's happening in Florida, too. That's why we're probably going to see drilling offshore before we know it.
Well, let me point out something. The entire dirty energy industry, they could have avoided this lawsuit altogether. You know, a couple years ago, before the suit was even being brought, when this flood authority that we talked about earlier was drafting their plan for mitigation, what they came up with was a plan that required obviously billions of dollars for new levees and new redirections of the Mississippi Delta. But they went to the industry and said, look, you guys know you're responsible for this. We have your admission. Can you kick in over years $18 billion? We, the state of Louisiana, we will come up with the rest. We just need you to give $18 billion for the damage you've caused. And they still said no. They forced this lawsuit upon themselves because they knew they could win it. But
yeah, they had a Nanette Brown in their pocket.
Exactly.
Well, okay, let me ask you something, Farron. Okay, this is an area where industry pumps more toxic chemicals, where the oil industry and the chemical industry, they pump more toxic chemicals, more carcinogens into the air and into the water than most any place in the world, by the way, including China. You could compare what goes on what they call Cancer Alley there in Louisiana with what goes on in China, and you can't tell the difference. What is it if you have federal judges that won't let this case go forward? What's the next move?
Well, obviously the case is going to be appealed, but then at that point it's going to depend on who's on the appellate court. And as we have discussed so many times, as we've written in the Trial Lawyer magazine, there aren't that many good courts left. You know, Republicans have done a phenomenal job over the years of packing the courts, and especially now with the Citizens United, we have seen more money than ever in the 2012 midterm elections, or 2014, excuse me, flowing into judicial elections. You know, tens of millions of dollars, whereas in the past it would be a couple million. And so if there's a judge that has been elected, he has been elected or she has been elected with industry money, and if there's a judge moved
up the ranks. In other words,
right.
Before Nanette Brown gets appointed, she has to have industry behind her. And the reason she was unanimously approved in Congress, obviously, was because industry loved her.
Right, and industry owns Congress. So if they want somebody to be approved, they start making phone calls. And that is exactly what happened here with this story. You know, the defense law firms started hiring lobbyists, and they started making these phone calls in order to get the case moved to Nanette Brown. So this, again, none of this was coincidence, and Nanette Brown was not a passive member of these law firms.
Yeah.
She was their environmental specialist sitting in courtrooms next to these people and defending their behavior.
So the net result of all this, Farron, is that more than 1,900 square miles of coastline in Louisiana has vanished over the last 80 years, and the industry is continuing to pollute what's left. And the industry admits that they're responsible for 40% of the wetlands loss. But basically, nothing, even with that admission of guilt, nothing's going to change because, again, money talks. And right now, with Citizens United, that money is completely out of control to where you can have the oil industry, the chemical industry, handpick the cherry-pick judge that they know is going to rule for them. And in the end, the people are the people who suffer. Farron, thanks. Good coverage on this.
Thank you.
Let's talk more about it as it develops. I know there's more to it.
Absolutely.